today I wanted to finish by talking about translation and Ijaz al-Qur'an, the miracles of the Qur'an a little bit, and then the tahaddi, the challenge of the Qur'an. And it'll probably be a good amount of time for Q&A. So translation in Arabic is called tarjama. Tarjama. And translations are inadequate, but they're necessary. As I said last week, one of my teachers taught me to say, whenever you quote the Qur'an in a language other than the original Arabic, you would say some of the meanings may suggest. Because Qur'an and Arabian, Qur'an is in Arabic. And there is a big difference between words chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, laysa kamithlihi shay'un. There's nothing like Allah. So whatever we're like, Allah is not like that. Right? Laysa kamithlihi shay'un. Mukhalifatun lil hawadith. He's completely dissimilar to his creation. So Allah doesn't speak a language, but He chose a language. He chose words from this language to convey pre-eternal meanings of the Qur'an. So it's very important for us to study this language. We learn different computer languages. For dunya, we should learn some Arabic. For dunya and akhirah. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنًا. Some people stop there, the Quran says. Right? So we should continue. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنًا وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنًا وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Amen. So, to learn some Arabic, there's an old Italian axiom. It's alliterated in Italian, but it's also alliterated in English, so it still works. The translator is a traitor. So translate and traitor sound the same. The translator is a traitor. In Italian, it sounds like this. Traduttore, traditore. Very similar. So, in other words, all tarjama is tafsir. Whenever you translate anything, you are interpreting it because you're choosing the words. Right? So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He chose the Arabic of the Qur'an. So we should learn some Arabic, inshallah. Translations occurred in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have translations of the Qur'an. Ibn Hisham mentions in his Sirah al-Nabawiyah, which is the better of the two, compared to Ibn Ishaq, even though Ibn Ishaq was slightly before, that when the Sahaba, some of the Sahaba made hijrah to Al-Habasha, to Ethiopia, and Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the older brother of Sayyidina Ali, he was the spokesperson for the Muhajirin, and he recited some Qur'an in Arabic, and then it was translated into ancient Ethiopic. Right? So the court of the Najashi, they heard in Arabic. And Ethiopic and Arabic are similar. They're Semitic languages. It's maybe the difference between English and Spanish. So you'd be able to catch a few words here and there. It's something of the interpretation or translation. But it was translated into Ethiopic. The first translation of the Qur'an into a European language was done from Arabic into Latin by Robert of Chester. His name was Robert of Chester. This was 1143 CE. This was under the patronage of a monk named Peter the Venerable, who was the abbot of Cluny, not George Clooney, the Benedictine abbot of Cluny. And Peter the Venerable, and this was during the times of the Crusades. So Peter the Venerable, he actually wrote a couple of polemical treatises against Islam. One is called The Summary of the Entire Heresy of the Saracens. Right? Now, Robert of Chester, when he translated the Qur'an in 1143, he didn't call it the Qur'an. He called it Lex Mahamud Sutu Prophetes, which says the law of Muhammad, the false prophet. That's the title he gave his translation of the Qur'an. So you see how the translator is a traitor. He didn't even call it the Qur'an. So you find this with Western Orientalists. what's known as a hermeneutic of suspicion. A hermeneutic of suspicion. So whenever the Prophet ﷺ does something in the seerah, he must have some ulterior motive for doing it. You know, so he marries Aisha, right? They say, oh, he was licentious. Or, you know, the Quran at times sounds like the Bible. Oh, he's a forger. That's why. You know, he's a pretender. So they always ascribe to him the baser motive. But when Isa a.s. does something in the New Testament, he's fulfilling prophecy. So, you know, he's pure and innocent. And he's, you know, genuine. So when Isa a.s. in the New Testament rides a donkey into Jerusalem, you know, he's fulfilling prophecy, right? According to these Orientalists. Of course, Jewish theologians would say that, no, Jesus is also a forger and he's, you know, self-fulfilling these prophecies, and right? So what it comes down to is the integrity of the prophet. That's what it comes down to. Who do you want to take your information from? The Quran says, O you who believe, when a fasiq, an open sinner, brings you some sort of news, fatabayyanu. Fatabayyanu means it's reflexive, right? It's reflexive, meaning something to the effect of, prove it to yourself. Don't take a fasiq's word for it. Prove it to yourself, right? So you might find something modern science is saying, something that NASA says, for example. You say, well, you know, that doesn't seem to square with what the Quran is saying. For instance, well, the Quran is the words of the Prophet ﷺ, ultimately the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we give precedence to the Prophet ﷺ because the integrity of the Prophet ﷺ. We'll talk more about this later, inshallah. But with the Western Orientalists, they're guilty of a double standard, unbalanced methodology. That whatever Muslims do, you know, there's a hermeneutic of suspicion. They're doing it for some other motive. But when Christ and Mary do something, it's called a hermeneutic of acceptance. Right? Now, the first translation into English, the first translation of the Quran into English was done from French, not directly from Arabic. So Arabic, French, and English. It was by a man named Alexander Ross, 1649. He was a Scottish Orientalist who wrote at the introduction, newly Englished for the satisfaction of all that desire to look into Turkish vanities. I can say that with a British accent. Newly Englished for all that desire. Actually, it was Scottish. I don't know how to do a Scottish accent. The first translation into English from original Arabic. So, original Arabic into English, 1734. George Sale, S-A-L-E. George Sale, also known as the Jeffersonian Quran. Right? So there's a Quran in the Library of Congress that belonged to none other than Thomas Jefferson, the third president. And apparently has some of his notes. Apparently he was learning Arabic. He was not a Trinitarian. He was a Unitarian. Many of the founding fathers rejected the Trinity. They did not agree with a mixing of church and state. So that was sort of the vision of America early on, was to avoid what was happening in Europe, especially England at the time. That's why they were basically rebels. From an English standpoint, from a British standpoint, they're guilty of treason. Right? So they were settlers that left Europe. So America was designed initially to be sort of the antithesis of what was happening in Europe. So a secular society, not a secularist society. There's a difference between the two. Dr. Sherman Jackson will point out the difference between a secularist society where religion is completely banished from any type of public discourse. It's something you do in your house, and that's where it stops and stays. To a secular society, where one's faith can inform their decisions, and it's based on what people want to do. So if you want to present, for example, the argument that abortion should be illegal because it's against Catholic morality, you can certainly present that argument, like in Congress. It probably won't be successful if that's your reason. Right? Maybe it could be. Most people in Congress apparently believe in God, right? But most likely that won't carry the day. You'd have to give some sort of social repercussion to the ills of abortion. Right? So there is room for religious discourse. Right? So that was the vision of the founding father. So they were deists. A deist, D-E-I-S-T, is someone who believes in God, but does not believe that this God necessarily interacts with creation. So a creator God, a wholly transcendent God, he's too high for any type of involvement in human affairs. Right? So they take this idea of caliphate to an extreme level. You are charged with the responsibility of creating justice on earth without any type of grace from above. Right? So anyway, Representative Keith Ellison, who's the only Muslim in Congress, he took oath by putting his hand on the Jeffersonian Quran, the actual Quran of Thomas Jefferson, translated by George Sale in 1734. There are major errors in this translation. It's probably because he just didn't know Arabic that well. I mean, that's personal fun, right? There might be something else happening, but in chapter 22, Surah Al-Hajj, verse 39, this is the first verse revealed to the Prophet ﷺ that gives him permission to militarily defend the Muslim Ummah. Right? And if you read that ayah in Arabic, all of the verbs are passive voice. Passive. Mabni ala al-majhul. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. So permission is given to those who are being fought against because they have been wronged. Everything's passive. Permission is given, not he gave permission, to those who are being fought against. Not permission is given to those to go fight and to go wrong people because they have been wronged. But Sale doesn't notice the passive verbs here. He makes them active. So he says something like, permission is given to those to fight against or take up arms against unbelievers, or something like that. So making the verb very offensive rather than passive. So in translation theory, there's different ways of translating the Quran. John Dryden, who was an English poet, translation theorist, he says there's three ways of translating. He says the first way is called paraphrase. He called it paraphrase. Modern translation theorists, like Eugene Nida and others, they'll refer to this as dynamic equivalence, or a sense-for-sense translation. This is the gist of what it's saying. Right? Sense for sense. This is the meaning. This is what the author means. Another way of translating is called metaphrase, which is also called formal equivalence. And this is more like word-for-word translation. So Yusuf Ali's translation into English is more paraphrase, sense for sense. Where Marmaduke Pichtal is more metaphrase, word for word. And the ulama really tend to gravitate more towards metaphrase, towards a more word-for-word translation, but with a commentary. Right? So there's pros and cons to both approaches. You know, the sort of downfall of a word-for-word translation is that you don't really get the intended meaning. You're just getting exact wording. What does that actually mean? Right? And then the downfall of a paraphrase is you don't get any of the linguistic juice. You get the meaning, but you don't get that linguistic element. Why this word in relation to this word, or the syntax, the word order, that's all missed, right? And then you have something called imitation. Imitation is, or adaptation. What would the author have said if he were alive today? So you'll have some idiomatic expressions in the Qur'an, or in the Bible. You know, a camel through the eye of a needle, for example. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter paradise. That's in Matthew. And in the Quran, the camel through the eye of a needle. Ataie الجمل في سم الخياط. Mentioned in the Quran. Surah Al-A'raf. So what does that mean? Camel through the eye of a needle? You can translate that literally. And that's what it says. Al-Jamal fi Sam al-Khayat, the eye of a needle. So that's great. So that's your metaphrase. We can paraphrase, you know, and sort of get the sense of that. That it's really, really hard, almost impossible, for a rich man to go to heaven. That's the paraphrase. And then there's imitation. So use an analogy that people know, that people use today. So something like, it is easier to find a needle in a haystack than for a rich man to enter paradise. You get what I'm saying now, right? So it's possible to find a needle in a haystack, but very, very difficult. Right? Okay. Any questions on translation theory? Anything we talked about? Probably the first language. Yes?
So what's the best translation?
Best translation in English?
Yes.
Is it Abdul Halim? You know Abdul Halim's translation? I think excellent translation. That's his name, right? Abdul Halim. Yeah, it's a very good translation. Thomas Cleary is a good translation. I actually like Yusuf Ali, to be honest with you, because he uses classical English. And it's not very user-friendly for people who don't know English very well, because it uses all these these and thous and thine. What does that mean? Right? But the Quran is Fusha. It's the height of Arabic. So I think if you're going to translate something that is so incredibly high Arabic, you have to use high English. So even quoting the Prophet ﷺ, some of the du'at, you know, the people making da'wah, they quote the hadith in colloquial English. They translate the hadith into colloquial English for the sake of the shabab, the youth. Every time that they do that, I sort of cringe, you know, because that's, you know, one of the, and they're using bad grammar and things. That's how the youth speak. Well, instead of, you know, bringing the language down to the youth, we should try to pick them up, take them to a higher level. Because even if a hadith is sound in its sanad, it's absolutely sound in its sanad, but there's a grammatical error in the hadith, it's da'if. Because the Prophet ﷺ used incredibly eloquent Arabic. And he didn't make grammatical errors when he spoke.
How about Muhammad Asad's translation?
I'm familiar with it. I don't know.
Language is a dynamic entity. It changes in meaning over time.
Yeah.
So over the years, Arabic probably have the same sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
So does that mean people are understanding Quran differently now?
Yes, very good question. Yes. Any language that's alive, right? You have dead languages and you have alive languages. The language of Isa alayhi salam is dead. It's Syriac. No one speaks it. many dead languages, Ugaritic, Ethiopic, well, it's still alive. Most Semitic languages are dead. Arabic is flourishing. So the nature of a living language, or an alive language, is that it will take on other words called loan words. They incorporate those words. Not only that, words within the language will have new meanings. So it depends on which Arab country you go to. You might find a word that in classical Arabic means one thing, but in the colloquial dialect, the lahja of that Arabic country means something completely different, right? So the important thing is when we study Arabic, we study Fusha Arabic. We study how these words were, what was intended by these words at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So we have to study something of the history of the language, right? So oftentimes you'll have Arabs read the Quran and make major errors in translation. Just because you know Arabic does not mean you can translate the Quran any more than a college student who's a pretty smart guy. Give him a Shakespearean sonnet and say, translate this. And he'll say, you know, this is English, but I have no idea what it's saying. All I know is that it's English. I'll get a word here and there, right? But, you know, classical Arabic, some would say, is a different language than, you know, Darija, like colloquial Arabic. It's a different language. And you get that with other languages, other pre-modern or ancient languages that are now spoken in a more colloquial sense, like Greek, for example. The Greek of the New Testament is called Koine Greek, common Greek, very simple Greek, whereas the Greek of Plato, oh my God, and I have experience with this. I took 2 years of common Greek, and I thought I was pretty good at it. And then I took a class in advanced Greek, like Attic Greek. And we read the Republic, and I thought it was a different language, a different level, right? Which is interesting also. I mean, Christians believe the New Testament is the Word of God, but the eloquence of the New Testament is not on par with Plato or Homer. So Nietzsche, you guys know Nietzsche, he used to quip, he was an atheist, he used to make a joke. He would say, it's so nice of God to give us such a remedial form of Greek to write his holy book. Right? So, yeah, that's true though. That Arabic today has, you know, I'm thinking another example, the Torah. It says the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That's in Genesis. And the word there for hovered at the time of the composition of that verse just meant to hover. But now that same word in modern Hebrew means a hoverboard. The Spirit of God was a hoverboard. So someone who's reading that verse in Genesis, a modern Israeli, for example, read that and say there was a hoverboard at the time? Because that word, the meaning of it changed. Same word, the meaning has changed. Okay, the next section here is a short section. I'jaz al-Qur'an, the miracles of the Qur'an. There is a linguistic aspect to this, a linguistic miracle. We'll talk about that. Some have said there's a numerical miracle of the Qur'an. Numerical miracle. We shouldn't get too much into numerology. It's called gematria, right? Ilm al-Jafr, I think it's called in Arabic. Ilm al-Jafr. This is something that Imam Ghazali warns people against, getting too deep into numbers, right? There is a sort of metaphysical component to numbers, you know. So, you know, there's things about the number 3, the number 9, the number 11, the number 13, the number 33. There's some sort of metaphysical properties, if you will, to those numbers that people who are numerologists, who are practitioners of gematria, they know well. So a lot of the things that we do in those numbers is to protect ourselves against the sort of evil counterpart. So we do things in 11, right? Or 33 times after every prayer. For protection, protective purposes. But there's Dr. Shabir Ali in Toronto. He mentions that there are interesting things in the Quran with respect to numbers. The word for man and woman is mentioned the same amount of times in the Quran. The word day is mentioned 365 times. Yom is mentioned 365 times. Which is a little strange because that's the solar calendar. The lunar is 354, 355. But, interesting. We don't insist on any of these. Say, oh, that's, that's how it is. And, it's definitive. The word month is mentioned 12 times. Shahr is mentioned 12 times. Angel and demon, like malak or malaika, and shaitan, shayateen, they're mentioned the same number of times. Angel and demon. Land and sea, according to him, are mentioned the same ratio of land and sea on earth. So like 73 to 27 or something, whatever. There's something about the number 19, figures prominently in the Quran. This is, again, getting into numbers can be dangerous. There was an Egyptian scientist named Rashad Khalifa. I don't know if you've heard of him. Founded a sort of cult, a pseudo-Islamic cult, called the Submitters, who believe that he's Rasulullah. That's what he claimed to be. He claimed to be the final messenger of God. He was apparently killed in 1990. A very mysterious person, Allahu A'lam, but apparently he said that the Quran has this numerical code about the number 19, and appendix. He translated the Quran into English, and his appendices are very strange. It's like you're reading the manifesto of the Unabomber or something. All these equations everywhere. Equals 19. Blah, 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 19. 5 pages of equations equals 19. Allahu A'lam. I don't know if he's fudging the numbers or what, but it's interesting. He used to go on tour with Ahmad, actually. They would have a sort of tag team. And in early editions of Ahmad's book, The Quran is a Miracle, he had a dedication page where he thanked Dr. Rashad Khalifa. And then on one of the events, man Khalifa stands up and says, I have an announcement. I'm Rasulullah. So they stopped going on tour. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, 19 letters. Alayha tis'ata ashar, upon it are 19, different things like that. Yeah, but if you look long enough into something, you'll find what you're looking for. So there's a lot of Christians who have this claim about the Bible, that there's Bible codes and things like that. And if you line up the letters of the Bible, it'll spell like Pearl Harbor or something. So somebody an atheist actually did this with the book Moby Dick by Melville, lined up like a crossword puzzle. It was able to find like George Bush, September 11th. Yeah, he said you can do this with any book. If you look hard enough, you'll be amazed what you find. These crossword puzzles they give in the restaurants to kids? I almost always find my first name in every single one. I mean, it's only 3 letters long, but these are very small. I was like, Ataie, right here. And I told my daughter, look, Ataie, she was low. So Allahu A'lam, Was there a question? I thought I saw a hand up. Yes.
When you said that they did the same thing with Bible, but which Bible? I mean, there's King James Version and there's different versions.
Yeah. Well, they're looking at the Greek. Yeah. So these are more advanced scholars. I mean, obviously it's done with English translation as well. And you'll find it in either one. Because if you're looking at a 400-page text, you eventually will find something. Some Muslims, they go into sort of scientific miracles of the Qur'an, like hard sciences, natural sciences, sort of in response to new atheism. So you have books by Maurice Bucaille, which is spelled Bucaille, he's a Frenchman. I think he's French-Moroccan, he was a physician. He converted to Islam. Or did he convert? I think he converted. So he wrote a book called The Quran, the Bible, and Modern Science. It's an interesting book, very interesting book. And you have Harun Yahya writing, whoever he is, Dr. Jeffrey Lang. The danger here is that, again, we shouldn't insist on something because science tends to be fickle and change its mind every so often. So if we take a definitive stance, the Quran advocates, globular, heliocentric cosmology, that the Earth is a globe, it spins on its axis at 23.4 degrees. It's going 1,000 miles an hour, even though you can't feel it. And then it's flying around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour, even though you don't feel it. And then the sun is flying around the Milky Way at 500,000 miles an hour. Well, that's what the Quran is saying. Big Bang cosmology. There's an ayah in the Quran that, Big Bang cosmology, also called Friedman, what is it called? The Hawking-Hartle Lemaitre model, standard model, that if you extrapolate the universe backwards, it comes down to a point of singularity, a primeval atom, which exploded for no apparent reason. And then this explosion caused the cosmos. So, one of the only times in history where an explosion created something that was ordered. Imagine blowing up a refrigerator and then having the parts eventually form a working cell phone or something. Very strange. But that's the sort of standard scientific opinion now. Right, so the ulama, some of them point to verse 21, chapter 21, verse 30. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Do not the unbelievers see? أَنَّ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتْ رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. Don't they see the heavens and the earth, which is a euphemism for the cosmos? That universe was a single unit of matter. A single unit of matter. Ratqan means like something stitched up, about to explode. فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. And then we clove it asunder. We did that. Right? Some will say this is talking about Big Bang cosmology. According to this cosmology, the universe is expanding into the infinite darkness, as it were. And it's actually accelerating in its speed. It's not slowing down, which is sort of counterintuitive, because the second law of thermodynamics says that eventually things will go through entropy and slow down. Right? But it's expanding, increasing. Science can't explain that. So science, modern science has sort of these catch-all terms. When they don't understand something, they'll say, for example, oh, that's just gravity. You say, what's gravity? Here's an equation that nobody understands, except one guy sitting at his desk and scribbling on a piece of paper. Well, they say, how is the universe increasing in its expansion? How is the speed increasing when there's supposed to be entropy? I say, well, something is forcing it out. What? Dark energy. That's what they call it. Dark energy. So what is dark energy? We don't know. But there's something actively forcing it out. Right? Some of the ulama point to this verse, Al-Dhariyat, Surah 51, verse 47. How does it go? I don't remember. But it says something to the effect of, some of the meanings may suggest that we created the heavens bi-aydin, with hands, literally hands. What does that mean, do you think? We created the sama bi-aydin. Bi-aydin. What does that mean? What do your hands do? You know, if somebody like, what's the expression in English? Somebody says, I'm all thumbs. What does that mean? You ever heard that before?
Can't do anything right.
Yeah, he doesn't have skill. I'm all thumbs. I can't even tie this shoe. So we ate it like with skill. We created the heavens with skill. وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ وَسَعَ, from wasa'a. And we are expanders. We are the expanders. You know, wasi' means expansion. Wasi'a kursiyyuhu as-samawati wal ard. Right? We are expanding it, not dark energy. Or like, you know, Jupiter is going around the sun. It's called the heliocentric model. The helios, the sun, is in the center. But according to their calculations, Jupiter is just not big enough, even though it's apparently huge. It's still not big enough to sustain it in its orbit. It would just fly off eventually. Or it should have already flown off. So what's keeping it in its orbit? There's something else keeping it there. So the scientific community says dark matter. So these are catch-all terms. So the more popular opinion in the pre-modern world is called, is referred to as the geocentric model. Geocentrism is that the Earth is stationary and that the heavenly bodies are revolving around the Earth. Now, nowadays, if you even suggest something like that, you'll be crucified, basically. Not only that, there's a growing movement nowadays, and this is not just amongst Christians, this is in the scientific community, that the Earth is actually a plane. It's a flat plane. It's not globular, and it's stationary. It's a very popular movement now, you know. And there are some who, I mean, there was a Saudi Arabian scholar who I think made a critical error and was definitive on this point and said the Earth is definitely flat. And I asked him, why is that? No, he said the Earth is not moving. He said it was flat, and he said it's also not moving. And he said, well, how do you know that? He said, well, according to their model, if the Earth is round and it's spinning, right? If you're flying from west to east, and it takes you 4 hours to get there, on the way back, since the Earth is coming at you at 1,000 miles an hour, you should get there in half the time, in a third of the time. Right? Not realizing that those who take the position that the Earth is rotating believe that the atmosphere is rotating with the Earth. Right? So it's going to take you the same amount of time to get back, because the atmosphere is being dragged along with the terra firma, or the crust of the Earth, as well. But there are some who dispute this and say that there's no evidence of the Earth's curvature. Right? It's very popular. For example, people will, you know how you look out to the horizon, go to a beach or something, and you look out and you'll see the ocean, it'll rise up to your eye level, and then it just stops in their sky. So the scientific community says that you're actually, your line of sight has ended because there's curvature in the earth, right? This is what Aristotle saw. Aristotle believed in geocentrism. He believed that the earth was at the center. The sun and the moon go around the earth. The earth is round, however, according to him. And he said, well, ships go out, and then they vanish from your line of sight because they're going over the curvature of the earth. Now, nowadays there are people who buy these, you know, this Nikon P900 camera, which is a very powerful zoom lens. And you'll notice the ship go, and then they'll zoom in, and the entire ship is brought back. Right? Or you can calculate, according to the scientific community, what the curvature of the earth has to be per square mile. 8 inches per mile squared. So there was a man who took a picture of the Chicago skyline from the other end of Lake Michigan, 60 miles away. According to the scientific community, you shouldn't be able to see any of the skyline from 60 miles away across the ocean. Maybe the top of the Sears Tower, maybe, because the entire city should be behind 2,200 feet of curvature. You should have curved away from you long ago. He snapped a picture in clear weather, the entire Chicago skyline is visible, from the ground up. There's many people that have different examples of this, that they cannot detect the curvature of the earth. Right? So they have a different model that they use.
How about the photograph that you see from space?
Yeah, so people don't like these photographs. Every photograph we get is from NASA. And NASA admits they're all composite images. This is something they admit. That basically they're different photographs stitched together. You know, everything that we see is either a composite image or CGI or a cartoon. So, yeah, certainly, I mean, and then the other thing is, like, NASA will release a picture of the Earth every so often that looks completely different. I think one of them in the United States is enormous, another one is really small. You'll see, like, they have this sort of animation that they say is real of the Earth spinning, but the clouds don't move over, like, a 10-hour period. I say, oh, you know, it's animated. It's not an actual picture. So there's a lot of distrust of NASA, apparently, amongst this movement, that you haven't really seen the curvature with your own eyes. So their argument is that your senses and experience suggest that the Earth is motionless. That's what your senses suggest to you. And when you go out to the beach and you see the flat horizon, right? You can see twice as far this way and that way as you can this way. Twice as far, but it's always flat, you don't see curvature. And then they say independent researchers have sent up weather balloons, 121,000 feet, 3 times the height, 3 times the altitude of a 747, and the horizon is completely flat. There's no evidence of curvature, according to the evidence that independent researchers have compiled. And then some of the proponents of this movement, most of them are Christian, but again, not all of them. They'll say that this is what the Bible is saying and what the Quran is saying. I actually quote verses from the Quran. الَّذِي جَعَلَ لَكُمُ الْأَرْضَ فِرَاشًا, right? The one who made for you the earth as a carpet. Or bisaqan, bust. Bust means something that is wide and expansive, flat, wide. So, again, insisting on a certain position is dangerous. Right? Allahu A'lam. Allahu A'lam. I don't know. It's also interesting is that the moon is a very interesting thing. You know, the moon is so, and that you can actually do this if you want to. What we're being told is that the light coming from the moon is reflected sunlight, right? That's what it is, right? Now, if you're in direct sunlight or in the shade, which one do you think has a higher temperature? Which one? Direct sunlight, right? Yeah, direct sunlight. You're standing in the sun. Now, let's say there's a full moon. Where do you think the temperature is higher? In direct moonlight or in the shade? In the shade, it's the opposite. So if the sunlight is bouncing off the moon, that's colder than the moon shade. Is it the same light? So there's another theory, and this is something that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Again, the geocentric model over history was a dominant opinion. It's just since the time of Copernicus and Galileo. I mean, these guys are, anyway. Kepler, Isaac Newton, right? So it doesn't seem like it seems like the moon is emitting its own light. And there are times when you ever see the full moon during the day, you can see right through the moon. The craters of the moon are blue because the sky behind is blue. There are people who photograph stars through the moon. You can see a star through the moon. This is documented. People take out their, independent researchers nowadays, they take out their Nikon D900, they can zoom in on the moon and see stars through the moon. So the moon seems to be sort of semi-translucent. It's transparent. It's a light. The Quran calls it nur. It's a light, and the sun is a siraj in the Quran. A nur, like think of a night light in a lamp. A night light has its own light, but it doesn't light up the entire room. But a lamp, you turn it on, everything's lit. Right? So it's very strange. What's happening here?
Wait, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
The whole, like, the world is round or whatever.
Yeah.
With all this stuff you're giving, why did you ever believe it was round in the first place?
Why do we believe it's round?
Yeah, like, where's the proof that it is round?
That's a good question.
Like,
Some would say there's no proof. All they have are these pictures which are doctored, which is interesting.
But all the astronauts who have gone up to space station and all that, they say it's round.
I mean, yeah, that's what they say. We haven't seen a picture of it. I mean, they have these images of astronauts working on a space station with the Earth in the background. But you look at the Earth, there's no satellites, which is supposed to be 20,000 satellites. You don't see a single one. You don't see any planes anywhere. And every so often, one of their videos, you'll see like bubbles come up, which means they're in a pool in front of a green screen. And you can find these videos. So, I mean, how does water convex itself? So if the Earth is round, water is bending itself. Can I do that? Can I conduct that experiment? I can certainly pour water into a container, and the water will take the shape of the container, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about pouring water out and then making it into a convex sculpture without it, because water always finds a level.
But it's the gravity which is keeping it.
That's the whole answer. It's a big catch-all. It's gravity. It's gravity. So how is that? Don't worry about it. It's gravity. So people are in Australia walking around upside down. And trillions of tons of water are sticking to the earth upside down because of gravity. But a bird flying over the ocean. So gravity is so strong that it holds all this water, but just weak enough for a bird to fly over the ocean. Or a fish to swim through that water. Right? It's very strange. Fickle thing gravity is. It's very fickle. Right? If I sit on the earth and I have a big magnet in my hand, and the paper clips on the earth, certainly the magnetic force of the earth is more than this magnet in my hand, but everything will fly up to my hand. Why doesn't it stick to the earth? It's a bigger magnet. So that's sort of the catch-all. It's all gravity. You know, Sir Isaac Newton, right? A knighted Freemason occultist. Sitting around, an apple falls on him. Oh, there's gravity. What an epiphany. No, it's called relative density. You know, so this phone will drop because the molecules are denser than the air. But if I hold a helium balloon, it'll rise, defying gravity. No, it's just helium is not as dense as the oxygen. Right? That's Occam's razor. That's the easy answer, not the sort of mysterious gravity that's convexing water. So initially, this sounds like a totally ridiculous notion, right? But those who make this argument again are saying that there's scientific backing for it, and that the vast majority of the opinions of human beings throughout history is that the Earth is geocentric. So if you look at Polaris, the North Star, it's always fixed, right? And all the other stars are going around it. So all of our constellations have been there for thousands of years. Same stars, in a perfect circle around us. So if we're moving in 1,000 miles an hour, and we're also going 67,000 miles an hour, and then that is going 500,000 miles an hour into infinite space, how is this so perfect? Shouldn't it be chaos above us? Right? It seems like everything is going around us. That's the point we're making. Everything. The sun and the moon, all of the stars. It seems to be a geocentric model. And if this is true, then immediately people say, there's something special about us. Someone designed this. Because modern scientific opinions is that we're just some backwater planet on some solar system in some corner of a Milky Way galaxy, and just an accident that exploded, and we're from monkeys anyway, so we're not important. So there's no God. So the whole thing about gravity again is if you can replicate that, give you a big mass, or you can stick water to the bottom of something. Otherwise, it's a faith. You believe in gravity. I believe in God. Replicate the experiment.
So if you don't believe the science, or what the science is saying about, and then if you don't, then there has to be some way of ascertaining whether it's right or not. And the Quran says that the sun and the moon and the reflected light. And so that kind of tells us, right? I mean, that's a one way to...
Yeah, but we shouldn't be definitive. Because if we're definitive on things, and I think it's a great wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give us definitive answers. Because the scientific community keeps changing their mind. Right? So even if we believe the Quran is correct, even if the Quran says it's flat, definitely flat, and then, for 2,000 years, people are ridiculing the Muslims and saying, you guys are barbarians, you're crazy, it's not flat, and then 2,000 years later, they say, oh yeah, it's flat.
It was for sun for many, many years, it was not known that sun moves, right? And in Quran, Allah says sun moves.
Yeah, does it? I don't know. وهو الذي خلق الليل والنهار والشمس والقمر كل في فلك يسبحون. Yeah. كل في فلك يسبحون. The sun and the moon are moving. All of them are in an orbit. فلك يسبحون. Also, nothing about the moon is you never see the dark side of the moon. You never see the back side of the moon. So if it's orbiting, why don't we ever see the back side? All it does is go like this. It just rotates like that. It never turns around. Here's no backside. It's a light. It's translucent. You can't land on something like that.
But then you don't believe they landed on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, how do you get through the Van Allen radiation belts? Even right now, if you talk to modern scientists, they say, what's the biggest challenge with space travel? So we can't even get a low Earth orbit. We're 200 miles from the Earth, and then there's massive radiation belts. We have to figure that out. This is 50 years after 6 moon landings. They can't go 200 miles off the Earth. But 50 years ago, they went 500,000 miles round trip, 6 times. $19 billion they fleeced from the American public. $19 billion.
Actually, Japanese and Indian spacecraft are going around the moon right now, according to what you hear.
Yeah, and these are private government-owned organizations. 550 astronauts have been into space. 94% or something are Freemasons. It's a secret society. It's a fact. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, the first men on the moon. 33-degree Masons. This is a fact. And a secret society keeps secrets. Neil Degrasse Tyson. You heard of this guy? Also a Mason. He's sort of the go-to guy of the modern scientific world. They asked him about the shape of the Earth because you can see Polaris from the southern hemisphere. You can see the North Star from the southern hemisphere. So if the world is a globe, you can't see it. You're on the bottom of the equator. How do you see Polaris? So he said, you know what? The Earth, because it's spinning, it's like pizza dough. This is what he's actually saying. This is their guy. This is NASA's guy. Because it's spinning, it's like pizza dough, and eventually it flattens out. Right? And then, it's actually pear-shaped. So the bottom is actually fatter. So this is the Earth like that. So if you're below the equator, you can see Polaris. So according to the opinion of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's their scientist, eventually the Earth will be totally flat, eventually. It's like pizza dough, apparently. This is what he's saying. Very interesting. So there's definitely a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of people that are...
When there is a big earthquake, actually you can see the waves in the earth crust. So actually it does happen. Earth behave like a fluid.
Like a fluid?
Yes, when there's a huge earthquake, you actually can see the waves.
Yeah, the wave, because the tectonics, the plates have shifted, so it creates a tsunami. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the Earth is round. So that's the main issue, is curvature. So if you're living on a spherical Earth, let's say this is the Earth, right? This is a helicopter. And you start to rise. As you go up, the horizon will stay low, right? Because it's going away from you. It's falling off the horizon, right? If you're going straight up, the horizon does not rise with you. It stays, and then you have to keep looking down at it. So if you're at 38,000 feet, you have to look down at the horizon, right? But if the Earth is a plane, a flat plane, and you get inside of an airplane, that's why they call it an airplane, by the way, because it flies over a plane. You sit in an airplane, and you're in the middle row. You just turn your head like this, and there's the horizon. It's right there at your eyes, both sides, as if you're down on the Earth. If you get into a weather balloon and go to 121,000 feet, it's right in front of you, the horizon. So for many, this is the definitive proof that it's a flat plane. This is the proof that they use. Many experiments were done. We never heard of some of these people because they're not, Samuel Rowbotham, right? We know Kepler and Galileo. We haven't heard of these other guys who conducted an experiment in a river 6 miles long. So something 6 miles long is usually 16 feet of curvature. So something 6 miles away in a standing body of water, the it's 6 miles away and it's 16 feet high, you cannot see it, according to the globular model. It would have curved away from you. But he looked at it completely through his telescope. The whole thing was there. Many experiments like this. So, again, I'm not saying that Earth is alone. I don't know. I mean, it's we have to be about our business, right? But the thing is, for a lot of people, if geocentrism is correct, and we are unique and everything's going around us, then suddenly God becomes very important. Who did this? Who put us on this pedestal? Why did he do it? How do we thank him for it? Oh, we're just monkeys, right? We're monkeys on some backwards. NASA just said, we found 7 new planets. They're just like Earth. Sure they did. I don't think so. Anyway, out of time. But again, it's and there's other things in the Quran, embryology, alaq, something that clings to the uteral wall, which is impossible for someone to have known that without a microscope. The Quran apparently talks about fingerprints. They're called banan, that Allah will resurrect even the tips of the fingers, which is sort of like your identity card, as it were. The origin of all life is water. There's other ayat that people look at. But we have to stop doing it over time. But I'd love to talk more about this book. This is what's happening right now in the world. So, hopefully you benefited from the class. If so, please make some dua for me. And inshallah, we can continue with another class soon. Maybe related to this or not. Maybe we can do a tafsir class or just looking at tafsir or something like that through a classical lens. Inshallah, maybe we can read some surah from the study Quran. It's a good text to have. It's a good text to study with.